Hey everybody, welcome to another Hebrew Bible lecture. This time we're going to be talking about wisdom literature, and we're going to start with an overview of wisdom literature and then move into the Proverbs. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to it. So, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, which you'll usually hear me call Kohelet because that's the Hebrew name for the book, are collectively called wisdom literature, which is a subset of the Ketuvim, the writings in the Hebrew Bible, and they're part of the books of poetry in the Christian Old Testament. So these three books, these wisdom books, are a representation of the collective writings of the sages of ancient Israel, essentially, and also some from the period of early Judaism. So wisdom itself is a tricky thing to define, but you can see here on the handout, I've got a few definitions for it that are helpful, that I think are useful ways to think about the way that wisdom works in the Hebrew Bible, and also just as a general term outside of the Bible. So, in the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, the definition that they put forward is that wisdom in these books is essentially the discipline of applying truth to one's life in light of experience. Another scholar of the Hebrew Bible, a scholar specializing in wisdom literature, Jim Crenshaw, my old professor, says that wisdom is the reasoned search for thoughtful ways to assure well-being and the implementation of those discoveries into daily life. So reasoned search for thoughtful ways to assure well-being and the implementation of those discoveries into daily life. And you can kind of boil that down further into something that, this is more the way that I would say it, is knowledge tempered or seasoned by experience and then applied to the life. So it's more than just knowing something. It's knowing something in light of experience and then applying it. The application of it is important for it to really be wisdom, and it needs to be applicable for it to be wisdom. So wisdom literature in general, as a rule, what wisdom literature is it's based in experience. It's more based in experience than, say, revelation. So if you read the Torah, for example, the Torah starts out, when you're reading through the legal portions of the Torah, by basically starting from the perspective that this is divinely revealed. This is the way that things should be because this is the will of God. Wisdom literature comes at things from a bit of a different angle. For wisdom literature, it's more about, you saw what happened to the last 5 people that did that, didn't you? It's that sort of thing. So you can think of it as a sort of quasi or proto-scientific perspective. It basically applies observation and aggregate truths that, okay, so you've watched how this has worked out for various people. These people did it this way. These people did things this way. And, you can kind of extrapolate a basic rule that this is a better way to live than this way. That's the kind of approach that wisdom literature brings up. And so wisdom literature, in that sense, wisdom is a genre of material that appears across the ancient Near East. Also, you have all sorts of Greek epigrams and wisdom discussions and all of this. And the idea is that wisdom is the purview of human beings to learn by experience and from the experience of others. Now, this does not mean that wisdom is divorced from revelation. This does not mean that at all. This does not mean that there is no revelation involved in wisdom. So some proverbs, as we see, as you saw when you read through this, some proverbs do lean upon concepts that are derived from Torah. Some parts assume that if you do not start from a commitment to the idea that God can actually reveal things, that you can't have wisdom. That wisdom relies not only on human experience, but on the ability to learn the lessons from God through experience, that sort of thing. So these things kind of work hand in glove in wisdom literature. And as I said, wisdom literature was by no means unique to Israel. So we've got examples of wisdom proverbs and those sorts of things going back as far as 3000 BCE in Sumer, which eventually became Babylonia, the region of Babylonia. We've got stuff in ancient Egypt that goes back that far. So there's a ton of different things. And when you look at Proverbs themselves, these epigrams, these proverbial sayings show up all the time across every language in every part of the world. And some examples of these, some of the earliest proverbs that we have. So you've got some proverbs of ancient Sumer, for example. A thriftless wife living in a house is worse than all diseases. And you'll notice that a number of ancient wisdom sayings are somewhat, a little bit potentially misogynistic. They tend to be, basically from a man's perspective more often than not, and sometimes aren't necessarily all that positive about women. There's an example. You have flies enter an open mouth. So basically, this is a way to say, keep your mouth shut. You're better off with your mouth shut. And then you have what has been spoken in secret will be revealed in the women's quarters, which is, you can take from that what you will. We also have in Proverbs 22, actually the section from Proverbs 22:17 through chapter 24, actually bears a lot of similarities to various Egyptian proverbs of Amenemopet. So you've got probably some overlap there. There's some definite borrowing in wisdom literature, and in Proverbs, there are all sorts of things that go across cultures and are borrowed from one culture to another. Now, biblical wisdom literature is not restricted to Proverbs, to various epigrams and proverbial sayings, like what we were just looking at. It also includes stories, proverbs, we've talked about. It includes fables, school lessons, riddles, instructions on etiquette, precepts, hymns, prayers, wise counsel from learned instructors, that sort of thing. It's all sorts of different little types of, different forms of literature, forms of wise sayings and stories and all sorts of things. And because of 1 Kings 4:29 through 34, so in 1 Kings 4:29 through 34, we're told that Solomon was the wisest king who had lived to that point, and up to to his day, and to the point of the writer, that no one had been a wiser person, wiser king, and that he spoke 1,000 proverbs and all of these things, and he basically becomes considered to be the father of the Israelite wisdom tradition, and is assigned authorship of many of the biblical proverbs, and also we saw the Song of Songs previously, and also Kohelet, as we'll see. So thing is, the way that this works for Solomonic authorship of a lot of these sorts of things, and it's not impossible. It's not impossible that some proverbs actually do go back to Solomon. Who knows? Historical Solomon, wise guy, perhaps, and maybe he had a way with words, and stuff gets remembered and written down and all of that. But it's more of a phenomenon of, you think about how Abraham Lincoln once said, you can't believe everything you hear on the internet, everything you read on the internet, right? Or how Albert Einstein has been assigned all sorts of wise sayings of every type that, of course, Einstein didn't say. Because these are people who essentially have that reputation of they are the source of great wisdom in American culture. And so, you don't know who said it. Well, it must have been Einstein. Well, as Einstein said. And so you have all sorts of things, or as Abraham Lincoln said. So you have all sorts of things that there's a sort of magnetic pull to assign various wise statements in, I've seen in the evangelical or the Christian realm, for example, C.S. Lewis has this magnetic pull. Stuff gets assigned to C.S. Lewis that C.S. Lewis clearly never said. And so you have all sorts of different things that just magnetically gravitate. It's by someone else, but ultimately over time it just gets assigned to the person who is associated with that kind of wisdom, or that kind of statement, that kind of tradition within the larger tradition. So that's sort of what happens with Solomon. Solomon becomes the magnetic north, the center of everything for wisdom literature, and everything kind of goes back to Solomon. Everybody, if there's any doubt, then the assumption is, well, this is from Solomon. So this literature, I should mention also, provides a very interesting window on everyday life. So if you want to know how people actually lived in the ancient world, we've got all sorts of stories. We've got a lot of different things, but a lot of those stories are, it's sort of like reading Harry Potter or reading, The Catcher in the Rye to figure out how people lived in the modern world. Or even worse, watch a show like Full House or Modern Family or something like that and imagine that that's the way that Americans live. Or Friends. Somehow Friends has gotten really, really popular among, you young folk. I do not get it. It's not one of the better shows of its era, but hey, whatever. But imagine thinking that Friends or Full House or Modern Family is a representation of how basically everybody in America lives. When in fact, very few people in America have the level of money that the various characters and families of those shows actually have to be able to live anything approximating those lifestyles. It doesn't look at all like what we see in those sorts of things. Well, wisdom literature actually helps us in the sense that these are proverbial sayings that speak to the specific world that people are actually living in. So it gives us a little bit of a sense of how people are actually living. So that's a nice window into day-to-day stuff. So that's helpful. Now we're going to move into the book of Proverbs now. The book of Proverbs is sort of is ground zero for biblical wisdom. The book of Proverbs is the sort of platonic ideal of what biblical wisdom is. And that, again, it makes sense because the very idea of a proverb is that it's a short, pithy, profound saying that encapsulates a distinctive understanding of the world or how best to live in it. Or how best to live in it. It could be all of the above. And so it is, the proverb is sort of is a wisdom statement boiled down to its pithiest and most profound form. That's the idea. And so we've got all sorts of, and there are all sorts of American proverbs that tons of people know, right? Waste not, want not, buy cheap, buy twice, better safe than sorry, right? Be the labor great or small, do it well or not at all. When a task is once begun, never leave till it's done. These sorts of things. Watch your pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. God helps those who help themselves, all sorts of different things. These are traditional American proverbs, and pretty much everybody is going to know some variation of these kinds of proverbs that speak to specific ways of looking at the world. And the biblical proverbs are very similar. Now, there is some organization. This is not, the book of Proverbs is not just a list of saying after saying with no organization. There actually is an organization of this book. Nevertheless, there are some, for the most part, the book does seem to be very loosely organized for the most part. So you have chapters 1 through 9 are a separate set of material that leads off the book, and it says the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. There you go. When we get to chapter 10, you'll see that there's a new introduction where it says the Proverbs of Solomon. So what you have is two collections of Proverbs, chapters 1 through 9, and then chapters 10 through 22 that are then spliced together to form a larger collection, all of which are assigned to Solomon. All of which, these are the Einstein says sort of things, or Confucius says. Many of the things that are assigned to Confucius actually came from later people who added them to the Confucian tradition. It's very similar to that with Solomon. In fact, Solomon you could look at as the Confucius of ancient Israel, right? That's sort of the role that he plays within the tradition. And then you actually have a few additional small collections. You have chapters 22:17 through chapter 24, which is sayings of the wise. So these are just the sayings of the wise, of sages, sage sayings. And then you have another collection of again, Proverbs of Solomon, copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So you're getting additional material that's added in that says, okay, well, these are Proverbs of Solomon, but they come from Hezekiah, king of Judah. So, did I say Israel? King of Judah. So you have, again, a third collection of Proverbs of Solomon, essentially, that are assigned then to a later time that they are written down at that point. So assigned to Solomon, almost certainly not from Solomon, but in the Solomonic tradition. That's the kind of idea. And then you have chapters 30 and 31, which are tacked on, and we don't even know who these people are, but you have the sayings of Agur, son of Yakeh, and then you have the sayings of King Lemuel, and we don't know who these kings, this King Lemuel is, or Agur, the son of Yakeh, but these are wise people who then these final two chapters are added on to the larger collection to sort of serve as a close to the collection. So a few things, and I'm not going to belabor this lecture too long, because this is one of those books that you really have to talk through and discuss a good bit to really get the key here. To understand how to read these, you have to practice. You have to spend time really chewing on this stuff. But a few things that we can talk about in terms of how Proverbs sets things up. So first of all, Proverbs is the book of proverbial wisdom or conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is conventional in that it presupposes that the world is orderly, that the world works in a certain way, which is why you can have Proverbs. When you say buy cheap, buy twice, you're saying that, look, it's better to buy something that's a little bit more expensive up front, that's higher quality up front, so that you don't end up having to buy something again because you got something cheap initially. And the idea is that you're better off doing it this way because the world is orderly. The world actually works a certain way. And embedded within the form of the proverb is that there are some ways, in light of the fact that the world is orderly, that there are some ways of living that are better than other ways of living. Not all cultures are equal to the proverbial world. Some ways are better. Better to buckle down and study hard and get good grades and get yourself a scholarship and a chance to graduate with as little money as possible going forward, so that you can wind up having a better job. And all of these are the sorts of things that presume that, well, you do these things and you'll end up having a better life. And the idea is that some ways are better. Some ways of living are better than others. Don't do drugs, kids. Well, why not? Well, if you do drugs, if you do a bunch of recreational drugs, you're going to wind up having a bad life. Yeah, but what if I enjoy them? Well, again, the idea is that that's not the best way to live life. So some ways of living are better than others. And then you have the second presumption of that is that if you act in the way to think about the best ways of living is if you act in accord with the order of the universe, you're going to be better off. Specifically, you're going to be more likely to be happy and prosperous. So don't go against the grain of the universe. If you're swimming against the grain of the universe, if the universe works so that people who work hard wind up better off, and you decide to be lazy, odds are not good that you will end up being as happy and prosperous as someone who actually works hard and sets himself up based on how the world works. Now, all of this is based on statistical or aggregate thinking. There are exceptions to very nearly everything. So, one proverb, for example, that I put into your reading that was in the assigned area is, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Or actually, you can read that, it will not depart from him. It could work either way. Both of those both of those work as far as translations of that in Hebrew. But in either case, I'm guessing that pretty much all of you, anyone who is watching or listening to this, knows some people who, they're good parents, good people. They followed all the normal steps, all the things that you would expect to produce a good kid and a productive adult. And it turns out that it just didn't work out for them, that their kid, their now grown child, their adult, just turned out to be a really rotten person. And, if it was 100% situation where train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, well, then you wouldn't have bad parents, or you wouldn't have good parents producing bad people and bad parents producing good people. And both happen. But that doesn't mean, in the context of wisdom literature, that doesn't mean that the proverb is wrong. What it means is that the proverb is right on the aggregate. So statistically speaking, you are much more likely to wind up raising a better child. Someone, actually, as my father used to say, I'm not raising a child, I'm raising an adult. Right? I'm not raising children, I'm raising adults. Okay, so you're more likely to produce a more productive and happy and reliable and just good adult, I guess, a good citizen, say, if you are a good parent than if you're a bad parent. Statistically speaking, that's going to work very strongly in that direction, that good parenting is more likely to produce a happy and stable outcome for the child. But there are exceptions. That's built into the proverbial wisdom thing. So, buy cheap, buy twice. Well, sometimes you buy cheap and you don't buy twice. Sometimes it's the right thing to buy twice, or to buy cheap. Sometimes it's the right thing to buy twice. So Proverbs then assumes, in any case, since it's better to work with the grain of the universe, Proverbs assumes, on the aggregate, that there is a pretty straightforward cause and effect mechanism for the world by which people get what they deserve. So ultimately, if you work hard, keep your nose clean, don't do drugs, do your homework, study hard, get good grades, you're going to wind up having a decent job, making enough money to survive and have a family and that thrives and so on. You're going to wind up having a reasonably good life. And it's a straightforward situation, because what you do, what you reap, is ultimately what you're going to sow. So your hard work plants the seeds for what's going to come up later, and eventually you reap the rewards of your hard work. So people get what they deserve. That's the basic idea in proverbial or conventional wisdom. So, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Well, why not? Well, because if you do that, then here's the result of that. Actions have consequences. Actually, I have a friend who learned in the process of being a good parent, she would explain to her 2-year-old child that actions have consequences. And so, if you do that, if you throw that toy at your younger brother, then I'm not going to give you this cracker. Throws the toy, actions have consequences, the crackers are going back, and this would be the sort of thing that she would say. Of course, this precocious 2-year-old at one point then demanded some sort of treat or, food or whatever, and when she said, no, not right now, he happened to drop trowel and urinate on the floor while telling his mother actions have consequences. So this is the sort of thing that a 2-year-old grasped the idea of proverbial wisdom, right? This is the idea that, there's a straightforward cause and effect. You don't give me what I want, and I'm going to do something that you don't want. And the world works this way. And actually, this is the sort of thing that, generally speaking, good parenting tries to reinforce to children. You try to reinforce that if you do this, this is going to be the result. And you hear all about, it's important to be consistent when you're raising children. Super important. It's critical to be consistent. Consistency is what matters. Well, why? Because ultimately that builds in the habits and the respect for these cause and effect mechanisms for ultimately how you get what you deserve. And you build in this sense of justice into the child that you're raising. That's the idea. And built into that is this assumption that the world works in this way. And really, ultimately, this boils down to a pretty formulaic approach to the world in the proverbial or conventional wisdom way of viewing things. The idea is A plus B equals C. If you do A and B, you're going to get C. A and B are the inputs, C is the consequence, the outcome. Output is determined by input. That's the idea. So train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, it will not depart from him. There you go. Poor is the one. So just looking over here at some of the proverbs that are in front of me. Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes one wealthy. So if you're lazy, you become poor. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, you end up lacking resources. But if you're diligent, if you work hard, then you're going to have wealth. You're going to have resources. A plus B equals C. He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. Right? And why? Well, ultimately, those things result in bad things. They result in bad consequences. So there's a lot going on there in terms of the basic assumption of the world. And you'll want to remember this kind of A plus B equals C kind of approach. So give instruction to a wise man and he will still be wiser. Teach a righteous man and he will increase his learning, right? So that's what we have. Then we have core themes that we get into in terms of Proverbs. And there are a few things that we should discuss in terms of this. And there are some passages that I'll quickly go through to address what you need to know in terms of this. So the first and primary theme of the book of Proverbs is that wisdom ultimately derives from and is in sort of its essence the fear of Adonai. And if you look at the end of chapter, if you look at the middle, actually, the middle part of chapter 9, it says, the fear of Adonai is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of Adonai is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And beginning here, this doesn't just mean beginning. It can also mean sort of, it's the core, it's the essence, it's the heart, it's the source of all wisdom. So if you want to have wisdom, you have to first fear Adonai. Well, why? And the idea here is that Adonai is a just God. And so if you are devoted to Adonai and you are convinced that Adonai is just, and that means you're going to get what you deserve, if you have expectation of just judgment, then you're going to do the things that are wise. If, however, you imagine that there is no judge, that there is no specific consequence, that there's not someone who deals justly in terms of consequence, then you might be tempted to do things that are not wise. And you can see all through the book. You go to Proverbs 3:7. We'll go to that over here. Proverbs 3:7. You have, Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear Adonai and turn away from evil. Well, why would you turn away from evil because you fear Adonai? Well, because again, even if you think you can get away with it, the idea is that Adonai is going to ensure that you get what you deserve. 8:13. Pride and arrogance in the evil way and the perverted, the fear of Adonai is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance in the evil way and the perverted mouth I hate. So you have that. 9:10. We already looked at that one. 16:16. When we go 16:16, we see once again how much better to get wisdom than gold. Or 16:6, I'm sorry. By loving kindness, by chesed and truth, emet, iniquity is atoned for. And by the fear of Adonai, one keeps away from evil. Why? Because again, you expect that Adonai is going to do right. And if you deserve wrong, then you are not, then Adonai is going to give that to you. You can't find a way, you can't trick Adonai. You can't find a way to cheat the system because it's ultimately overseen by a God who sees all and deals with his people justly. So what does that mean? That means do the right thing. even when no one is watching, do the right thing, because that's what wisdom is doing the right thing, doing the thing that is in accord with the way that the world works, because the world was constructed to work this way by a just God. That's your primary theme throughout the book of Proverbs. That's what it is to live a good life. Now, there are multiple subtopics and sub-themes throughout the book of Proverbs that are worth a good amount of discussion. And we'll need to spend some time in the discussion session. We'll need to spend some time going through that. But the basic idea is you start with family relationships, respect for parents, discipline and education. You see the contrast between the behavior of the just and the wicked, the value of good friends, and especially a good and loving spouse, written generally from the perspective of the man, so a loving wife in particular. You see the virtues of honesty, generosity, justice, and integrity. You see an emphasis on the mastery of passions, especially with respect to sex, and also intoxicating substances, which the idea is that intoxicating substances lead to poor decisions. So don't put anything in your body that's going to make you do stupid stuff. And don't mess around with putting your body in places that are going to lead to really bad consequences. The sexual stuff in here, interestingly, in Proverbs, it's less about, this is sin. This is a matter of purity before God or whatnot. It's that sexual misbehavior leads to really, really bad results on the aggregate. And don't think you can find a way around it. It's going to ultimately come back to bite you. That's the idea. And then there's a ton of emphasis on proper speech and knowing when to speak and when to shut up. A lot of emphasis on just keep your mouth shut. And then wealth management, proper planning for the future, the way that you're supposed to live to maintain as prosperous a life as possible. And along with all of these things, you also have some characters that show up throughout the book. You have, first of all, Lady Wisdom, who shows up in chapter 1. She shows up, wisdom shouts in the street. And wisdom in Hebrew is chokhmah. And chokhmah is a word, it's a feminine word, and wisdom is personified as a woman. And as a woman who is personified as a kind of goddess, as a feminine principle that is present with Adonai at the very creation of the world. We see this actually when we get to Proverbs chapter 8, that wisdom calls out, and wisdom dwells with prudence. Wisdom is the one who, when we get to chapter 8:22, Adonai possessed me, wisdom, at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting, from eternity, I was established. From the beginning, from the earliest times, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. So you have this notion that wisdom is actually a pre-existent principle that is beside God, beside Adonai. From the very beginning, at the very creation, wisdom is there. So wisdom is primordial, is a principle that is as eternal as God himself. There's almost a notion that wisdom is the feminine principle that works together with the masculine principle, Adonai. So there's some interesting stuff there. But along with that, you have, alongside wisdom, who is this personified feminine figure that you should embrace, that you should invite in, and that you should study and come to know in depth. There's a almost sexual component to that. Then you have wisdom's opposite. And there we see Lady Folly. We see here that this woman, dressed as a harlot and cunning of heart, she is boisterous, rebellious. Her feet do not remain at home, right? So she comes in and she invites this young man to her bed. She's an adulteress, and with flattering lips she seduces him, and suddenly he follows her like an ox goes to the slaughter, like one in fetters to the discipline of a fool, until an arrow pierces through his liver. As a bird hastens to the snare, he does not know it will cost him his life. Therefore, listen to me and pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many are the victims she has cast down, and numerous are her slain. Her house is the way to Sheol, descending to the chambers of death. So this adulterous woman, this Lady Folly, the adulterous woman, is set as the opposite. You have two women that appear at various points throughout the book of Proverbs. You have Lady Wisdom, who represents all that is good and all that is prudent and wise, and then Lady Folly. You have the loose woman. You have the adulterous woman, who represents the things that look good right now. Instant gratification at the present, but stuff that's going to come back and bite you. It's going to lead to death. So those two women are paralleled, are contrasted throughout the book. And there's actually a strong emphasis on feminine qualities, actually, throughout the book of Proverbs. So you have Wisdom builds her house. She hews out 7 pillars. She prepares her food. She mixes her wine. She sets her table. And she invites people to come in and drink eat of her food and drink of her wine. Forsake your folly and live, and walk in the way of understanding. And along with that, you have other characters. You have the scoffer or the mocker. You have the righteous person. You have the wise person. And in this passage, you get several of these together. The one who corrects a scoffer gets dishonor for himself. The one who reproves a wicked man gets insults for himself. Then you have the wise man. Do not rebuke a scoffer, or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. Then you have the fool, who is the opposite of the wise man. You have the mocker, you have the fool, you have the wise, you have a variety of different characters that show up. The righteous, the number of other characters that show up throughout. Sorry, lost my spot. And finally, we get to chapter 31, and we get to this final closing encomium, this praise. This is the words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. And so this is ostensibly written by a woman. This is the idea. The idea here is that this is actually the product of a female author. So we have, to some degree, we have Lady Wisdom in a sort of incarnate kind of perspective. The mother is giving wisdom. And here we have a few things. It says, don't give your strength to women, or your ways to that which destroys kings. Like, be careful. Women will bring you down, son. And beyond that, be careful about what you put into your body. Be careful about intoxicants. And beyond that, here's the thing. An excellent wife, who can find? Her worth is far above jewels. Her worth is far above. She's worth way more than precious stones. Why? Because the heart of her husband trusts her, and he'll have no lack of gain. Why? If you have a wise wife, it says you're gonna wind up benefiting more than if you started with seed funding. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. And the interesting thing then is the characteristics that we see of the ideal wife here. And one thing you'll look for that you might expect in the ancient world, if you're, coming from a modern perspective and imagining how people in the past would have imagined femininity, you might expect that she's, a beautiful baby factory who, sticks around the house and does what she's told. Turns out that is not what we find here. An excellent wife is a person who works with her hands in delight. She brings her food from afar. She gets up while it's still dark, and she gives food to her household, portions to her maidens, servant girls. She considers a field and buys it, and from her earnings, she plants a vineyard. Wait, so she's a property owner? She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong, so she's a crossfitter. She senses that her gain is good. Her lamp does not go out at night. So she's a tireless worker. She's weaving at the spindle. She is generous to the poor. She doesn't fear the winter for her household because everybody's clothed well, because she makes coverings for herself and for her children. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies belts to tradesmen. So not only is she providing for her household, but she is providing, she works hard enough that she's able to, have her own Etsy shop or something. No, she has her own small business. The idea here is that she is a small business owner who owns land, who plants a vineyard. So you have all sorts of different things here that she exceeds what you would imagine would be possible in the ancient world. Strength and dignity are her clothing. These are the sorts of things that you would, again, if you were a misogynist and imagine that everybody in the past was misogynistic, you would imagine that these would be masculine traits. But the ideal feminine traits include strength, dignity, wisdom, kindness, hard work. Fascinating. It says her children get up and bless her. Why? Because she's all these things. And her husband also, and says, many daughters have done nobly, but you exceed them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is fleeting. Beauty is, the word vain here is hevel, and we'll see that show up. That word will show up in Ecclesiastes. Charm is deceitful and beauty is a vapor. It's ephemeral. But a woman who fears Adonai, she will be praised. Give her the product of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. And that's how the book closes. So it starts with Lady Wisdom calling out, and it concludes with a praise for essentially the embodiment, the feminine embodiment of wisdom in the real world, and what the ideal woman actually looks like. So that's the book of Proverbs. We're going to have plenty of things to discuss as we move forward. There's a lot of things I want to actually ask. Here's my ask as we go into the discussion that's going to involve Proverbs here. I want you to consider the various characters, and I want you to tell me what, according to Proverbs, defines, oh, and by the way, another character, the proud. That was the one that I was looking for earlier that I wasn't thinking of. The proud and the humble. According to Proverbs, what characterizes a proud person? What defines pride? In the sense that the Proverbs warn about. And what defines humility? So when we get together to discuss this, bring some answers and some verses to that. I also want to know what defines wisdom, in addition to the fear of Adonai. What are the characteristics of a wise person? And what are the characteristics? What is foolishness? How do those things manifest, in addition to the basic statements of understanding that justice will prevail? What are the things? How do you know what constitutes pride and what constitutes foolishness? But I especially want you to focus on what constitutes pride and what constitutes humility. I want answers to that when we come together to discuss.